NOMOS Glashütte is known today for a lot of things, particularly their in-house movements. But the movements you see today didn't appear overnight, and their evolution, I think, is best divided into three distinct eras: the early era, the Greek era, and the DUW era. This video will take a look at the early era of the so-called 1 series movements. It's an interesting period in their caliber development, but also one that is often overlooked, as the movements of this period are not typically considered in-house, an important trait for a Glashütte watch. NOMOS was founded in 1991, debuting its first watches the following year. They initially offered 4 model families to choose from: the iconic Tangente, the watch that is today most strongly associated with the brand, the Roman numeral wearing Ludwig, the sci-fi inspired Orion, and the square Tetra. These first examples were all equipped with a Peseux 7001 caliber, today known as the ETA caliber 7001. The movements were finished in Switzerland by Zubrod and assembled into watches in Glashütte. This was noticed by notable NOMOS neighbor A. Lange & Söhne, who lodged a legal complaint against NOMOS the same year. They argued that NOMOS watches shouldn't be allowed to wear a Glashütte designation on their dials because the movements were entirely Swiss. The court ruled against NOMOS, which would have received financial penalties for each watch sold. But by the time the judgment was finalized in 1993, NOMOS was performing enough work on the movements themselves to satisfy the legal requirement that at least 50% of the value of the construction of the movement be performed in Glashütte. This is achieved by adding, among other things, a different escapement, mainspring barrel, temperature-blued screws, polished gears, and either rhodium or gold plating on the plates. We can find a mention of this in their 1994 catalog. By 1997, NOMOS was modifying the movement sufficiently that the replacement parts were no longer cross-compatible with the Peseux 7001, and Peseux requested that NOMOS choose a different name for their movement to avoid confusion. And this brings us to the first movement in the 1 series, the 1T, which now came standard with gold plating, and besides the other NOMOS touches, which I already mentioned, it received a Triovis fine adjustment mechanism. Establishing a pattern that would continue throughout the series, the T in 1T stands for Triovis. The 1T was shortly followed by the 1TS when NOMOS developed a hacking seconds mechanism for the movement, which NOMOS referred to as a Sekundenstopp. As you might guess, the S in 1TS stands for Sekundenstopp. For the unfamiliar, a hacking seconds mechanism stops the watch from ticking when you pull out the crown. This makes setting the time to the second much easier. Conversely, a watch that does not hack will continue to tick even when the crown is extended. In 2001, NOMOS patented their first in-house designed and built date complication, which made its debut the same year in the Tangente datum. This original Tangente datum interestingly had the exact same dimensions as the typical 35mm Tangente, both in diameter and height. Today, the smallest option for a Tangente with a date complication is the 37.5mm Tangente 38 datum. The new caliber, which was essentially the 1TS fitted with NOMOS' new date complication, was known as the 1TSD, the D not surprisingly standing for datum or date. In 2001, NOMOS released the 1TSP and 1TSPD calibers, both featuring a traditional Glashütte 3/4 plate as well as a Glashütte Gesperr, which is the ratchet and click spring you see here beside the ratchet wheel. In their English literature, NOMOS refers to a Glashütte Gesperr as a Glashütte stopwork. If you compare the earlier 1T movements side by side with the later 1TSP, you can note that the 1TSP on the right has a single solid 3/4 plate, whereas on the 1T on the left, the base plates consist of 2 distinct sections. The 3/4 plate in German is called Dreiviertel Platine, or in English, 3/4 plate, and thus the P in 1TSP stands for platine or plate. It's worth mentioning that the 3/4 plate is a notable and visually striking characteristic of Glashütte watchmaking. It was developed in the mid-19th century by Ferdinand Adolf Lange, the founder of the aforementioned eponymous watchmaker A. Lange & Söhne. It offered a number of advantages over traditional construction, which at the time utilized various exposed bridges and cocks. And when A. Lange & Söhne was revived in 1990, so too was this visual hallmark of traditional Glashütte watchmaking, which today is found in one form or another on almost all movements constructed by Glashütte watchmakers. When these new 3/4 plate movements first became available, they were only found inside NOMOS' upscale models, the Tangente Gold and Tangente Gold Datum. But by 2004, they were being installed in all models that were equipped with a sapphire display back, though a watch with this new movement came at a premium of €90. Lastly, in 2003, NOMOS patented their own power reserve complication, which in German is called a Gangreserve Anzeige, or simply Gangreserve. This was first available in 2004 in the form of the Tangente Gangreserve and the Tangente Datum Gangreserve, available in either a stainless steel or gold case. The two calibers that featured this new power reserve can be summed up fairly simply: one TSPG and one TSDPG. Both have all the features of their forebears, plus this handy new power reserve indicator. And as I mentioned before, in German the power reserve indicator is called Gangreserve, and thus the G at the end stands for Gangreserve. And that's essentially how it goes with the pre-2004 calibers. To recap, let's run through a quick review of them for a little mnemonic reinforcement. Peseux 7001, the Zeprod finished Swiss movement used in the very first NOMOS watches. 1T, which among other things added a Triovis fine adjustment mechanism. 1TS added hacking seconds, which NOMOS called a Sekundenstopp. 1TSD introduced NOMOS' patented new date complication. 1TSP featured the in-house manufactured 3/4 plate. And 1TSDP added a date display to their 3/4 plate movement. 1TSPG introduced NOMOS' new power reserve complication. And lastly, 1TSDPG gave you the whole kit and caboodle: a power reserve, 3/4 plate, and a date display. Just kidding, there's one more. In 2004, with the 1 series calibers preparing for retirement, the 1TS, which we mentioned earlier and which was originally introduced in 1997, was updated and reintroduced in the form of the 1TS Super 30. In this form, the 1TS received perlage finishing, and though it did not feature a 3/4 plate, it was equipped with an in-house base plate. This meant that NOMOS was now making for themselves the last major structural component tying the 1 series caliber to the Peseux 7001 of the past. It also strongly hinted that a fully in-house caliber with all the trimmings was likely close on the horizon. In fact, if you look closely behind the balance wheel, you can see that the 1TS Super 30 already had a number designation beginning with the character Alpha. The 1TS Super 30 movement was available exclusively in Tangente models that were part of the colorful and limited Super 30 collection. This consisted of 30 different dial designs, each limited to 100 units. A Super 30 Tangente could be had for about €500, and they proved to be quite popular. According to NOMOS, half the collection sold out on the first day they were available, and by late October of 2004, just 2 months after initial release, they were sold out entirely. But one might speculate that they also afforded NOMOS the opportunity to prudently move some of its inventory of 1TS components before they would be made redundant by the introduction of the Alpha caliber. And while the 1 series had evolved from the humble Peseux 7001 into a capable family of movements that shared little with their Swiss progenitor, it was the Alpha movement that was first said to be an entirely and officially in-house made movement. After its introduction, the 1 series was retired, and thus began the next era for NOMOS, the Greek era. But that is a subject for another video. So I hope you found this informative and are shivering in anticipation of the next installment.